Hello everyone, and welcome to our first lecture in our microbiology course. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the basics of microbiology, meaning we're going to go over what microbes are and why they're important, and really start to build our foundation for the rest of the material in this unit, as well as the rest of the course in general. On this slide, you've got a couple of lesson objectives. What these are kind of the main points or main goals of the lecture. By the end of listening to this lecture, as well as doing your chapter 1 reading, you should be able to successfully do these things or understand these things or know these things. So these are good to keep in mind as you're listening and good to use as you're reviewing to make sure you're understanding the main points of the lecture. Over the years of teaching this subject, I have had a lot of people tell me that they are scared of this subject, that when they started it, they didn't really understand why they needed this subject, and that they didn't really think that they would like talking about these things. And so to help you guys start out the course understanding why this is important and why understanding about microbes and microbiology is important for everyone, not just future healthcare providers, I'd like to begin our first lecture talking about the importance of microbes and the importance of microbiology. And to do that, what I've done is I've grouped a bunch of topics into 4 main categories. And these 4 main categories really help illustrate to us why microbes are so important. So our 4 main categories are these right here. The first reason that microbiology and microbes are so important is that literally all life forms on Earth require microbes. Microbes are the foundation to everything, to all life on Earth. The second main reason that microbes and microbiology is so important is that we actually use microbes to make a lot of products. In medicine, in industry, in food production, microbes are used all of the time, and there are more examples than just these. These are just kind of the 3 main ones that we tend to use them in or would make sense in a broader context. But basically, we use microbes all the time to make stuff that we use every day. The third main reason that microbes are so important is that they influence our health. Microbes can be the cause of disease, but one of the things that we are finding is that there are so many instances where microbes actually help keep us healthy or help keep us from getting some kind of disease. And then the fourth category that I came up with is that microbes influence human populations and societies. You guys have seen this in the last 2 years, basically, and you have a firsthand understanding of how microbes help influence society, and they help influence people's movements, they help influence economies, they help influence our day-to-day activities all the time. So on the next several slides, we're going to go into some details about each of these 4 categories. Our first category of why microbes are so important is that all life on Earth requires microbes. Like I said on the previous slide, microbes really are the foundation to all other life forms. And really kind of one of the first examples of this is that microbes helped create the atmosphere that we know today. Prior to microbes developing photosynthesis, the atmosphere composition was very different and was not suitable for the life forms that we know of today, especially human beings. However, microbes developed this process called photosynthesis, where they took energy from sunlight and basically used that energy to create sugars, as well as release oxygen as a waste product. Over time, enough oxygen built up in the atmosphere that the atmosphere became suitable for life on land, especially certain types of eukaryotes like mammals, so like humans, like dogs and cats, horses, all of the other land mammals basically relied on the development of oxygen or the release of oxygen from these microbes into the atmosphere for it to be suitable enough for them to evolve. So a lot of times when people think about photosynthesis, they think about plants, and certainly plants are very important in photosynthesis, but really we need to take it back a step farther and realize that microbes were the first ones to develop this process of what we call oxygenic photosynthesis. There are multiple types of photosynthesis, but the one we really care about right now is oxygenic photosynthesis. So microbes were the first to develop this oxygenic photosynthesis, and as they did that for millions of years, billions of years, eventually the atmosphere changed enough so that it was suitable for other life forms to live on land and use oxygen. What you're looking at here on the right-hand side just is a picture of the Earth to kind of put things in perspective and understand how big our oceans are and how many microbes there must be out there doing this type of photosynthesis. You're also looking at something called stromatolites. I'm going to write that out. I'm just going to change ink color for a second. Stromatolites are basically big accumulations of certain types of microbes that were some of the first to develop this oxygenic photosynthesis. So we can see these big, they look like rocks, but these big kind of clusters or these big kind of rock-looking things are actually a conglomeration or a bunch of microbes kind of all stacked up on each other, mixed up with sand and other stuff from the ocean. But they are some of the earliest examples of these structures composed of microbes that helped create the atmosphere that we know of. What you're looking at here is called banded iron. This is just an example of when oxygen started becoming present in the atmosphere. It would react with things like iron in certain rocks, and it would create these bands in these rocks, and that is how, at least in part, how we can trace the development of oxygen through the geologic record and the development of the atmosphere over time. So all of these things have to do with just the microbes hanging out in the ocean, day in, day out, going through photosynthesis. So they have had an enormous impact on our lives in that respect, and they still do today, because most of the oxygen, or at least about half of the oxygen that is produced in the atmosphere that we breathe in every day, is created by microbes hanging out here in the ocean. So again, certainly plants are important, the rainforest and all of that is important, but the microbes in the ocean produce at least half of the oxygen in the atmosphere still today. Now, some other key things that microbes are involved with, and involved at least in creating the foundation for other life forms with, is the process of nutrient cycling. So nutrients are chemicals that are taken from the environment and used for growth and metabolism. And when organisms take them from the environment, basically that means that those nutrients are caught up in their bodies and not available for other life forms or other organisms to use. And so one of the big roles that microbes play in the environment and the way they help support other life forms is that they are often involved in cycling those nutrients so that once one organism is done with them, those nutrients get put back into the environment so another organism can use them. One way this happens is through the process of decomposition. So basically, decomposition is taking an organism or some other kind of living structure and breaking it down into smaller pieces. And microbes assist with that all the time. So different microbes can be involved in it, but one specific type of microbe called the fungi are one of the biggest microbes involved in decomposition. So there are fungi all over the world every day that are taking structures like leaves or plants or dead animal bodies and breaking them down so that the nutrients that were kind of caught up in those other living organisms are now released back into the environment. Microbes can also be involved in making nutrients available to organisms in kind of a different way. This happens a lot in the soil and is especially important with plant growth. So when we think about plants growing, we just think about their roots being in the soil, and they get the nutrients from the soil, and then those nutrients go up into the plant, and that helps the plant grow. And that is true to a certain extent. But what we have found over the years is that in these roots are millions or billions of microbes, again, oftentimes fungi, that will basically grow in conjunction with the plant roots. And those fungi allow the nutrients in the soil to actually get into the plant roots and get taken up by the plant. What we have found is that if those microbes are removed from the soil and we try to grow a plant in that same soil, then the plant is not able to get as many nutrients from the soil. It doesn't grow as big, it doesn't grow as fast, and basically its growth is just kind of stunted overall. So plants being able to extract nutrients from the soil is key for a lot of reasons. We talked about how they are involved in oxygen production, of course, but they serve as crops, right? So we need our plants to be able to get nutrients from the soil so that they can grow, so that we can eat the plants, so that we can get the nutrients that we need to be able to grow and stay alive as well. So really, it's these microbes in the soil that are helping the plants grow, and that helps in so many other levels for humans and other animals and other organisms as well. And then microbes can also be really key in terms of animal digestion. We have found that lots of animals rely on microbes living in their digestive tracts to extract nutrients and take up nutrients. So some examples, kind of one of the classic examples is, if you've heard of termites before, termites are little insects that tend to eat wood. But the thing is, the termites themselves cannot actually digest the wood. It's the microbes living in their guts, basically their intestines, that actually will break down the wood and allow the termite to use the nutrients from that wood. That also happens to a certain extent in animals like cows and what we call other ruminants. There are lots of microbes that live inside their stomachs and their GI tracts and help them digest the plant material that they eat. And what we found is that even in humans, the bacteria that live primarily in our large intestines, but to a certain extent in our small intestines, really help us with nutrient absorption, nutrient availability. And when we don't have the correct type of microbes and the correct balance of microbes, our nutrient absorption isn't quite where it needs to be. So microbes do play a really key role in not only helping us get nutrients from things like the plants that we eat, but also in helping us take those nutrients from the plants and get them into our own bodies. Our second main category of why microbes are so important is that microbes are used to create products that we use on a daily basis all the time. So there pretty much is probably not a day of your life that goes by where you don't use some kind of product that had a microbe involved in its creation. So I've got three categories listed here. We've got medicine, industry, and food production. And there are, of course, probably other examples that don't fit into these three categories, but just to give you a taste of kind of how microbes can be used to create things that we use all the time, we'll start out talking about medicine. So in the field of medicine, we use microbes to create things like antibiotics, vaccines, and various specialized treatments. Antibiotics are medications that work to kill bacteria. And they are actually naturally produced by lots of bacteria and fungi, which are types of microbes out in the environment. And they were discovered in kind of the 1920s, roughly, by a scientist named Alexander Fleming. We'll talk about him more later, so don't worry about his name right now. But basically, what he discovered was that certain types of fungi and certain types of bacteria produced chemicals that killed or inhibited the growth of other microbes. So what you're looking at here on this picture is that we have these little paper discs that are filled with a chemical that we call an antibiotic, and they are placed on top of what's called a Petri plate that has media in it, and it's covered with bacteria. This tan stuff you see right here is bacteria. What is happening here is the antibiotic that is on this paper disc is spreading through the media, or the agar, and it is killing, or at least stopping the growth, of the bacteria that are right here. So Alexander Fleming noticed that in his lab, and he figured out that we could grow the microbes that make these chemicals and basically extract those chemicals and put them into a pill form or an IV form or an injection form, and we could save people's lives as a result of those chemicals. So we still use microbes today to produce these antibiotics that are life-saving in many cases for people all around the world every single day. We also use microbes to make vaccines. Vaccines are medical products that are designed to expose someone to a very small amount of a microbe so that they are able to produce an immune response to that same microbe. And that way, when they are exposed to that microbe in the environment, they don't get really sick from it. So just to give a current example of the vaccine, and again, this is something that we're going to get into in a lot of details later in the semester, but you've heard about the COVID vaccine, I am sure, in the last couple of years. And the COVID vaccine basically takes a very small part of the COVID virus, puts it into our body, and allows our body to develop an immune response to the COVID virus, so that as we go out on our day-to-day lives, we go to the store, we go to, I don't even know if movies are open right now, but they might go to the movies, they travel, they go to work, whatever it is they're doing these days. And they are exposed to that virus, which is circulating in high levels in our society right now. They have the antibodies, the immune response that's necessary to protect themselves from getting very sick from the COVID virus. And then we also use microbes to do all kinds of special types of treatments. We can use microbes to produce insulin. So we can actually use microbes to take the gene in the human body that makes insulin, and we can force those microbes to make us a bunch of insulin so that people with diabetes who rely on insulin are able to get the insulin they need in a way that is relatively cheap and fast. We can use certain types of microbes to do cancer treatments. So there's a lot of research going on in using viruses to, which is another type of microbe, to create cancer treatments. And so we use these viruses and these bacteria and these fungi, etc., in lots of ways in the medical field to help create the products that we need to cure people of disease or to treat people's diseases or disorders, and really to just hopefully make life better in general for people. Now, in terms of industry, we can use microbes in lots of different ways. One way is through the process of what we call bioremediation. Bioremediation is when we basically take a living organism and use it to help clean up something toxic or dangerous in the environment. So you've probably heard of things like oil spills before. You may have heard of toxic waste dumps or things like Superfund sites. And basically, all of those are examples of situations where the environment has been contaminated with some kind of undesirable chemical. It could be oil, it could be something like arsenic, it could be mercury, it could be some other kind of dangerous chemical. And we can take microbes, especially designed microbes, put them in the environment and have them essentially gather up those chemicals and either take them inside their bodies so that they are kind of sequestered there or held there, or break them down into non-toxic components. So for example, with an oil spill, we can release microbes into that area, whether it's the soil or water where the oil has been spilled. And those microbes will basically use that oil the same way we use food. So when we take in food, we break down that food and we use it to create energy and to live. And those microbes are essentially doing the same thing with the oil. They're using the oil as their food. So they live in the environment, they take in the oil, they break it down into non-toxic components, they use it as their food, and then they release just things like carbon dioxide, just the way we release carbon dioxide as a result of us eating our food. This process doesn't necessarily clean up absolutely everything, but it's a way to help. Another kind of more current example of this is there's a lot of plastic in the ocean right now, and you've probably heard of things called microplastics, which are really, really tiny pieces of plastic that are essentially in every waterway on the planet, unfortunately. And researchers have recently figured out how to use certain microbes to help break down those microplastics. Now, that's not being used on a wide scale as of yet. However, the research is very promising, and hopefully we're going to see the use of those microbes to help clean up that aspect of the environment, because microplastics are very damaging in lots of different ways. We also use microbes in lots of personal care products, things like laundry detergents, toothpastes. They oftentimes will have the enzymes that come out of microbes put in them to help do the cleaning activities that we need. We can use microbes to make fuel in certain cases. So there are microbes that we can use to produce something called biodiesel. When you go to the gas station and you see that pump that says diesel fuel, diesel fuel is very similar to gasoline. It's different in the structure of some of the molecules that are in there, and so there are different engines to use a diesel fuel, but it works in a similar way as to how gasoline works. And diesel, what we call petrodiesel, the kind that we buy at the gas station right now, is a form of fossil fuel, and it's pretty damaging to the environment. But we can use microbes to create what we call biodiesel. That is essentially chemically identical to petrodiesel, the stuff we get at the gas station right now, and is not nearly as damaging to the environment. So that's just another example of one of the ways we can use microbes in industrial processes. Something to keep in mind is that I do have 2 dogs, and they oftentimes like to sit with me while I'm recording these videos. One of them is snoring right now fairly loudly, so if you hear her in the background, I apologize for that. I'm trying to get her to stop, but just know that you may hear that periodically. Moving on to food production. So many foods that we consume are created with microbes in some way or another. Just some examples that I've got here, things like yogurt, bread, cheese, ice cream, sushi, things like chocolate and coffee, and sauerkraut, kimchi, all of those foods, plus many, many more, these are just ones that are coming to my head right now, are created using microbes. Basically, pretty much all cultures and societies across the world have figured out that it is possible to use microbes to kind of modify raw food products and turn them into other things that we like to consume. And so many of the foods that are eaten on a daily basis by many people across the world are a result of some type of microbe being involved in their production. Now, our third major category of why microbes are so important is that microbes have a huge influence over our health. And most of the time when people think about microbes and health, they think about microbes causing problems and creating disease. And that is true to a certain extent. Microbes can cause disease in people, plants, and animals, and that can be problematic for us, for sure, on lots of different levels. But like I kind of alluded to on our first slide in this lecture, is that we have been finding recently that microbes are actually even more important in keeping us healthy than they are in causing disease. So most of the time, the microbes that live on and inside our bodies and on and inside the bodies of plants and animals and in the environment actually help keep us healthy rather than cause disease. So one of the ways that microbes can help keep us healthy is through our digestion. We talked about this a little bit earlier, where the microbes that live in our gastrointestinal tract, our GI tract, help with making nutrients available to us from our food. So essentially we consume our food and our body goes through the process of breaking that food down into smaller pieces. And as those pieces become smaller and smaller, the nutrients from the food become available to our cells. And to a certain extent, our cells can take some of those up themselves and get them inside our bodies and use them for growth and metabolism. But what we have found is that microbes in the GI tract play a really, really big role in making sure that we are getting many nutrients into our cells, that we're getting the right quantity of nutrients, that we're getting the right form of nutrient into our cells. And if you were to take away all of the microbes in the GI tract, we don't necessarily absorb those nutrients as well. Furthermore, we do have some examples of microbes actually creating nutrients for us. You guys have probably heard of E. coli before, so I'm going to write that out, just abbreviate it. It has actually a much longer name, but I'm just using its short name. So you've heard of E. coli before, and most of the time you hear about that, you've probably heard it in the context of people getting sick. Well, there are about 700 different types of E. coli, and maybe a handful of those, 5 to 7 of them, are involved in causing disease. But most of the other types are benign, meaning they don't cause disease, and some of them are even very helpful to us. All of us have E. coli living in our GI tract, and that E. coli is oftentimes involved in helping produce vitamin K. So we do get some vitamin K from our diets, but we also have E. coli living in our GI tract, mostly in our large intestine, that actually produces this vitamin. And that is absorbed by our cells and taken into our body, and that is involved in the clotting process. So we have various proteins that are created to help create clots when we get injured so we don't bleed to death and lose all of our blood, whether that's internally or externally. And vitamin K is involved in helping this cascade of protein production happen. So we have these bacteria that literally live inside our intestines, produce this vitamin, and that vitamin helps keep us from bleeding to death, hopefully at least. Another example of how microbes help keep us healthy is that they kind of coat our body surfaces. And because they coat the surfaces of our body, both inside and outside, they basically take up all of the space and all of the nutrients that you can find on the surface of our body. And they prevent other microbes from being able to attach and colonize and start to potentially cause disease. So on the surface of our body, we've got all kinds of different microbes that live, different bacteria, different fungi. And while they're there, they grow, they metabolize, they reproduce, and basically they take up so much space and use up all of the nutrients that are available, so that as we go about our day-to-day lives, we do our day-to-day activities and come in contact with potentially dangerous microbes, there's basically no space for those dangerous microbes to attach to our skin and start to grow and start to reproduce and cause problems. Now, of course, that doesn't work all of the time, but they prevent us from getting pathogenic or dangerous microbes on our bodies in a lot of cases. Now, of course, it is true that microbes can be involved in causing disease, and we know for sure that some microbes cause acute or short-term illnesses, things like colds and flus, and maybe certain types of infections you get on your skin. Those are all examples of short-term illnesses, basically, where the microbe gets into our body, starts to reproduce and cause problems, but most of the time our body can fight it off on its own, or sometimes we get help in the form of antibiotics or other types of medications, and that helps get rid of the infection, and then we go back to normal again. Some microbes can cause what we call chronic or long-term illnesses. Things like HIV, certain cancers are caused by microbes. We might get something like malaria, if you've heard of malaria before, or certain viruses that stick in our bodies and lodge there forever. Basically, those microbes can be involved in causing these chronic diseases or long-term illnesses as well that require treatment for many months, many years, or sometimes for the rest of our lives. And then there are also instances where we're starting to find there seems to be a correlation between microbes and certain diseases or conditions that were previously kind of unexplained. Now, in these examples, I want you to understand that I'm not saying that these microbes are the cause of disease. They just seem to be related to it in these cases. So what we have found is that children who get a lot of strep infections are more prone to developing obsessive compulsive disorder later in life. It seems to be that something about that particular infection and getting repeated infections with it causes damage to certain parts of the nervous system, and that makes someone more susceptible to developing this disorder later in life. Now, it's not to say that for sure, if someone gets a lot of strep infections as a child, they absolutely will get obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's not to say that everyone with obsessive compulsive disorder had to have a strep infection. We're just saying that it seems like children who get a lot of strep infections tend to be more prone to developing that later in life. We've also found that babies that are born in the winter and get a lot of viral infections, things like colds or maybe RSV, in the first year of their life, are more prone to developing bipolar disorder later on. Again, we're not saying that those viral infections are the absolute cause of bipolar disorder or vice versa. We're just saying that it seems to make someone more susceptible to developing that illness later on. We also are looking into situations with things like Alzheimer's and other types of neurodegenerative diseases to see if certain types of viral infections or other types of microbial infections make someone more prone to developing that later. We've also even found that the microbes that grow in our mouth, all of us have microbes growing in our mouth, can be involved in cardiovascular disease. So if we have an overgrowth of microbes in our mouth and we haven't done really a good job of brushing and flossing, those microbes may get into our bloodstream and start to cause damage in our cardiovascular system. They cause inflammation, they can cause potentially damage to heart valves, and so poor dental hygiene can be a risk factor for cardiovascular disease later on in life. Again, it's not the only cause, it's not even a definitive cause, it just seems to be related to it. It seems to make someone more prone to developing cardiovascular disease later. Our fourth and final category of why microbes and microbiology is so important is that microbes have a huge influence over human populations, societies, societal practices, economies, etc. Basically, no matter who we are, no matter where we're born, where we end up in life, who our ancestors were, all of us and all of our ancestors were affected by microbes in some way or another throughout our lifetime. So I've got some examples here. There are, of course, more than this. We can't cover every single example of how microbes affect human societies, just because we'd never get through it, because the history of humanity is also the history of microbes, and the history of microbes is the history of humanity. So just some classic examples I've got here. We've got the Black Plague, which was a situation where a disease spread through Europe in the Middle Ages and wiped out about a third of the population. We've got one that is slightly less bleak, but a little bit more interesting, at least in my opinion, is it's called the Tulip Mosaic virus. The Tulip Mosaic virus is a virus that infects tulip plants and causes this striping pattern that you see here. Most of the time, tulips are just the solid color, either solid red, solid yellow, solid whatever. But when they get infected with this virus, they get this striping pattern. And in the 1600s, this virus started taking over the Dutch tulip crops, and these striped tulips became very valuable. People would pay what amounts to today hundreds of thousands of dollars or thousands of dollars for striped tulips or for bulbs that would lead to striped tulips, and it caused this massive economic bubble that ended up crashing and causing damage to the Dutch economy and kind of reverberated through the European economy as a whole. So just like sometimes we see things like housing bubbles, etc., in modern day, there was this virus that led to basically an economic bubble in the 1600s, and the results of that were pretty dire for a lot of people. They lost their homes, they lost everything as a result of having kind of played into this, what they called tulip mania at the time. Another example, kind of from the history of what we now call the United States, was the Louisiana Purchase. When we think of the Louisiana Purchase, we may think of just Louisiana being this very tiny little state down here, overall in the the perspective of the world. But really, the Louisiana Purchase went from, and this is not going to be exact, but kind of went from roughly here all the way up to the north here. So, like I said, it's not exact, but the Louisiana Purchase was pretty significant in the development of the United States. And prior to the United States buying it, the French were occupying it. And the French were getting decimated by what we call yellow fever, which is a microbial infection that just kills lots of people, or used to kill lots of people all over the world, especially in the tropical regions. And so Napoleon from France had a bunch of troops in the Caribbean and in the Louisiana area, making sure that they maintained control over this pocket of land. And he decided he was losing basically too many troops to yellow fever, so he wanted to pull out, and he sold it to the Europeans, or the early Americans, I guess you would say, living there at the time. Of course, I acknowledge that this land was belonged to Native people, but the way history went, the white European settlers bought it from the French when they were controlling that region, and that really allowed for the expansion of the European settlers into the rest of, like I said, what we now call the United States. And it also provided the United States with a lot of the Midwest, which is a lot of cropland. So not only did it allow for the western expansion of what was then the early developing United States, but it provided those settlers with a lot of cropland as well. Another example is the potato famine. In Ireland, in kind of the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, there was a microbe that infected the potato crop in Ireland and just wiped out massive quantities of potatoes, which at the time was the main food substance for the Irish. So that caused a lot of people to immigrate from Ireland to what was the developing United States. In World War II, one of the major sources of death was not necessarily just the injuries that people sustained from the different weapons, but infection. And so right around World War II, antibiotics became widely available and were able to be given to injured soldiers. And that really helped influence the Allies being able to maintain and win the battles in Europe as well as in the Pacific. Still today, there are all kinds of mosquito-borne diseases. So a mosquito-borne disease is a disease that where basically a microbe is transmitted from person to person by the use of a mosquito or via a mosquito. And we tend to see those occurring, I'm just going to kind of highlight different areas of the world here, in the tropical regions of the world. So all of these regions here tend to see a lot of mosquito-borne diseases. I'm not going to color everything in here, but you get the gist. These areas of the planet are very suitable for mosquitoes to survive. And so we do tend to see a lot of disease in these areas carried by mosquitoes. Things like malaria, Zika virus, dengue fever, yellow fever, like I mentioned before. These are all diseases that are still being transmitted today and are causing problems for millions of people, if not billions of people, every single year. Another thing that we're starting to see is that these mosquito-borne diseases are starting to spread a little bit outside of these, what we typically consider the tropical regions, because the climate is warming, and there are regions that used to be unsuitable for mosquitoes that are becoming more suitable. So we're starting to see mosquito-borne diseases come out of what was typically considered the tropics and move into what we would call the more temperate regions of the globe. And these are starting to obviously infect more and more people as a result. Kind of a good example of that is if you've heard about the West Nile virus. The West Nile virus came from kind of this region of the world basically to begin with. And then as the climate warmed, the mosquitoes were able to live outside of the tropical regions of the world and start spreading into what we would have normally considered more of the temperate regions of the world. So that's just kind of a current example of diseases being able to live in more places because there's now more suitable habitat for mosquitoes. Influenza affects us every year. In about a century ago now, so in 1919, 1920, we had a huge outbreak of the influenza. It was called the Spanish flu, but actually it originated in Kansas, they think. That's where they kind of have the first samples of where they think it actually started. And that virus spread all over the world. It infected about a third of the population of the world. It probably killed about a sixth of the population of the world at the time. And so there's always the potential for the flu to get really, really bad again and spread throughout the world, cause a pandemic, and infect billions of people, potentially kill millions of people. HIV and Aids is another example. We have this virus that started somewhere in the middle of Africa, most likely after it evolved from viruses that infect other primates, and it basically jumped to humans, and that has now spread all over the world. So the entire map basically would be covered if we were showing where that virus has spread to. And of course, COVID-19. We've seen that spread all over the world in the last couple of years, caused all kinds of damage to economies, to people's lives, to the healthcare sector, to different businesses. And so you guys can see how these microbes affect human populations, whether it's through migration, whether it's through economic problems, whether it's through potentially destruction of crops, etc. So microbes have a huge influence on our lives, even if we don't necessarily think about that. And they have a huge influence on our history as well, or they had a huge influence on our history and our ancestors as well. So at this point in the lecture, you've heard a lot about the importance of microbes and the influence that they have over our lives, but hopefully you've asked yourself, what are microbes? She keeps talking about them and throwing these words out there, but she hasn't really defined them yet. And that is true. I haven't really defined them yet, because before we started getting into all of the little details and all of the measurements and lenses and everything that's involved in microbiology, I wanted you first to get an understanding of the importance of this subject and everything that these microbes can do in our lives. And now we're going to switch focus and start talking about what microbes are and how we define microbiology. So the definition of microbiology basically is the study of any organism that cannot be seen without a lens, or that cannot be seen with the naked eye. So microbes are living organisms that fall into this category of something that cannot be seen without the aid of a lens. The human eye is capable of seeing and resolving objects that are about as small as 0.1 to 0.2 milliliters. So you guys all know what magnification, or the ability to see something, is, but resolution might be kind of a new term. And resolution essentially means not only being able to see something, but being able to distinguish one item from another. So when we say the human eye is capable of resolving objects that are larger than about 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters, we mean not only are we capable of seeing it, but we're capable of distinguishing two objects from each other. We're capable of saying that is object A and that is object B. Anything smaller than about 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters, we might be able to see in that we might be able to perceive that it is there, but we cannot tell whether it is one thing or two things or three things, etc. So basically, microbes are these objects, these living organisms that are smaller than about 0.1 to 0.2 milliliters. Millimeters, not milliliters. And they are objects that we cannot see really and cannot distinguish without the help of some kind of lens system. Lens systems, whether they are as simple as a magnifying glass or as complex as certain types of microscopes, allow us to see things better. So basically they increase visibility and they increase resolution, which means they increase our ability to differentiate one object from another. And so I've got kind of a cool website that I really hope you guys check out. If you're looking at this, you're watching this right now on the video, if you pull up the PowerPoint that is linked into the textbook and you click on this link, it will take you to this really cool website that will allow you to kind of zoom in and out with kind of common objects in relation to each other. So it might have like a coffee bean, a grain of rice, and then show you really how small of objects we're talking about when we're talking about microbes. I've created this kind of example of what that website will actually do. So it will take things like a grain of rice, a cube of salt, and a pinhead. So right now, like you have a grain of rice right here, and you've got an example of a pinhead right here with a cube of salt, and kind of relatively how big the cube of salt would look on the pinhead. And then underneath that, those sizes, you would have things like different microbes and different types of molecules and atoms. So I really recommend you check out this website because it really is going to help put in perspective how small the objects that we are talking about in microbiology actually are. So it'll help you understand that, on a pinhead, we might be able to fit 7 or 8 grains of salt or cubes of salt or sugar. But when we're talking about microbes, we're talking about things like bacteria or viruses or protozoa. We might be able to fit hundreds or thousands or millions on a pinhead, potentially billions on a pinhead, because they are just so small. So I really hope you check that out. It's linked in the PowerPoint, and I can link it somewhere else in the course modules as well if you can't access it from there or something. So now that we have talked about the importance of microbes, we have defined what microbiology is and talked a little bit about lens systems. Now we're going to talk about what microbes actually are. So there are 3 main groupings of microbes that we study. There are prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and acellular microbes. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. And there are 2 types of those. There are bacteria and archaea. Now you guys, I'm sure, have heard of bacteria before, just by living your daily lives, reading things in the news, talking to people, everything like that. So these are the prokaryotes at least, that we will study the most in this class, because as far as we know, they are the ones that are most directly involved in human health and disease. They live in all kinds of places on the planet. They live on and inside our bodies. They help produce antibiotics. They help produce vaccines, or at least they can produce antibiotics and can produce vaccines in certain circumstances. They help produce food. They're basically really critical microbes for our day-to-day existence. Now, archaea are the other type of prokaryote. So they are also single-celled. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. And they are very similar to bacteria in cell structures, but they're different enough that they're split out into a separate group. We don't know a lot about how archaea might influence human health and human disease. That is a research area that is still very much ongoing. We do know that they are fairly significant environmentally. And oftentimes, although not always, but oftentimes they live in very extreme environments. So they may be what we call extremophiles. And to me, these are very exciting organisms. They live in places that are very, very salty or very, very hot or very sugary or have a lot of pressure or are very acidic or very basic. So they basically live, at least many archaea, live at kind of the extremes of life. And I think they're really, really exciting creatures because they kind of help tell us what the limits of life are. How hot something can be before life can't exist anymore. How salty something can be before life can't exist anymore. How acidic or how basic, etc. So these organisms tell us a lot about the limits, at least of life as we know it, and help us explore potentially other planets and looking for other life there, so that we can say, oh, this environment on Earth, whether it's really acidic or really salty or really hot, has life in it. And on a similar planet in another solar system, in another galaxy, it might have a similar environment as to what we can find on Earth. And so maybe that's a place that we can look for life. They can also be really useful in producing enzymes that we can use for personal care products, like laundry detergent. A lot of times laundry detergent will have enzymes that come from archaea. Sometimes oven cleaners will, because things like laundry and ovens often are very extreme environments. And so the enzymes, these proteins that archaea will use, can often withstand the washing machine or withstand the oven. And so we can use them in those types of contexts. What you're looking at here on this side the upper right-hand corner, all that pink coloring is a bunch of archaea that are living in this very salty water. So not always, but many times these extremophiles, these archaea that will live in really salty environments, will produce this pink coloration. And so sometimes when you look at very, very salty bodies of water, and I'm talking way saltier than the ocean, you can see this pink tinge to it, and that's because of the pigment that these archaea are producing. So moving on to eukaryotic microbes, obviously there are eukaryotic organisms that are not microbes, things like people, things like animals, things like plants. Those are all eukaryotes, but they are not microbes, and we don't tend to study them in microbiology as a result. So when we talk about eukaryotic microbes, we have 4 categories. We have the algae, the fungi, the protozoa, and the helminths. Eukaryotes can either be single-celled or multi-celled, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. And like I said, we've got these 4 categories that we study in in microbiology, because they fall under the category of microbes. We have algae, and we'll talk more about these in a future lecture, but just to give you some basics about them. The algae can be single or multi-celled. They are photosynthetic. Most of them live in the water, so most of them are aquatic. And they play a really big role in producing oxygen in the world. So when I was talking earlier about how microbes developed photosynthetic or oxygenic photosynthesis, these types of algae, the ones I'm looking at, kind of pointing out right here, this is an example of certain types of algae, are some of the ones that are still important today in producing oxygen. So little microscopic algae that live out in the ocean go through photosynthesis day in and day out, and they play a huge role in producing breathable oxygen in the planet. Fungi, I'm kind of going to switch colors here just to differentiate them, can be single or multi-celled as well. These are really critical for food production. They're really critical in decomposition and nutrient cycling. And they're also a major source of antibiotics. So I'm just giving the highlights of each of these right now. We're going to go into a lot of detail about them in a future lecture. But fungi, like I said, they're really involved in food production, involved in decomposition and nutrient cycling, major source of antibiotics. You're looking at some of them right here. Protozoa are another category of our eukaryotic microbes. These are single-celled organisms that have a cell structure similar to what we find in animal cells. They're not animals, but they are similar in cellular structure to animals. They play a big role environmentally in terms of regulating populations of things like algae and bacteria and fungi in the environment. Just kind of, they oftentimes serve as predators to those types of organisms so that neither one group tends to overgrow. They can make people sick. There are certain species of protozoa that will make people very sick. If you've heard of Giardia, that's an example of a protozoa infection. If you've heard of malaria, that's an example of a disease caused by protozoa. If you've heard of trichomoniasis, that's a sexually transmitted infection caused by protozoa. So the protozoa, aside from being important environmentally, they are also significant medically. And then our last group of eukaryotic microbes are the helminths. These are infectious worms. They're always multicelled, and technically they are animals. And they cause all kinds of problems for humanity. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the diseases, or they're found, the diseases that they are associated with are found in the tropical regions. Again, the tropical regions are just a really good place for living organisms to grow. The fairly stable temperature, the moist environment, lots of light, etc., allows a lot of organisms to grow well there. And so while we can find infections caused by helminths outside of the tropical region, most of the time infections caused by helminths are found in the tropics of the world again. They don't tend to cause a lot of problems in developed nations with highly adequate sewage systems and waste disposal systems, but in developing nations and in regions of the world where the sewage systems may not be as good at removing and treating waste, they oftentimes will cause a lot more problems. So you've got some examples of what certain helminths can look like, or what the eggs of helminths can look like here. And we'll talk a lot more about these diseases that they can cause in future lectures. Acellular microbes are microbes that are not made of cells. So you've probably heard in previous biology classes that the cell is the fundamental unit of life, and it is. And both prokaryotes and eukaryotes are made of cells. But these types of microbes are not made of cells. So we call them acellular because A means without. So there are two types of acellular microbes. There are the viruses, which are composed of protein and nucleic acid. I'm trying to decide what color to use. So they just have proteins and nucleic acids. They have basically a protein covering that surrounds the nucleic acid on the inside. And the whole goal of a virus, and remember, they don't really have a goal, they're not conscious, but what a virus is programmed to do by its nucleic acids essentially is get inside a living cell and reproduce itself. That is the entire, like I said, goal of a virus. It cannot do anything on its own. It has to be inside a living cell to be able to do anything. If it's not inside a living cell, it's just inactive. It's just hanging out doing nothing. But once it gets inside a living cell, its goal really is to take over that cell and use the machinery that cell has to make copies of itself. It's the sole purpose of a virus. And then prions are very intriguing. They are just pieces of protein. I'll write that over here. So prions, they are just pieces of protein. They're essentially kind of rogue proteins that are a version of a protein that already exists in organisms, but they're kind of an altered version of it. So you can kind of think of it as a normal protein and its evil twin. So a prion is essentially the evil twin of a normal protein. And what these prions do is they insert themselves into cell membranes and they cause the membrane to fall apart. And as they do that, they cause any nearby proteins to take on their shape too. So not only do they cause cells to fall apart, but they cause nearby proteins to change shape and essentially turn into more prions. And so this causes the next cell to have prions in it and fall apart as well. And then that next cell will have prions in it and fall apart as well. And so they cause widespread damage in the nervous system, primarily in brain tissue, and cause basically big holes to form in the brains of organisms. Now, lots of different organisms can have prions. For us, they're most significant, obviously, for humans and for animals, because as we are humans, it matters to us if our brains or the brains of people we love and care about start to fall apart. They tend to be less significant to us if they are affecting fungi or affecting bacteria or affecting protozoa. But we care a lot about the prions that infect humans and infect animals. One, because we don't want, hypothetically at least, don't want people's brains to fall apart. And two, sometimes these prions can be passed from one person to another, or sometimes from animals to people. And so sometimes these prions can be infectious, meaning that we can have situations where this prion is passed from one person to another or an animal to a person, and we are essentially passing on this piece of protein that will cause the brain to fall apart and get holes in it, which is obviously not desirable. So, that is the end of this lecture. And just to kind of recap this slide so we don't end it on the prions, we have three main categories of microbes. We have the prokaryotes, the eukaryotes, and the acellular microbes. Each has at least two subcategories. There are two types of prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. Four types of eukaryotes that we study in this class. Remember, there are different types of eukaryotes that are studied in different classes, but in this class there are four types: the algae, the fungi, the protozoa, and the helminths. And then there are two types of acellular microbes, the viruses and the prions. And we will go into a lot of detail about each of these in future lectures.